Hello, everyone. My name is Sharnice Peters, and I am a Policy Program Analyst for the Division of Energy Assistance within the Office of Community Services. On behalf of OCS, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, providing a 60-minute review of Module 2 of the FY 2021 Performance Data Form, which is the Performance Measures module. Today's webinar will be presented by Melissa Torgerson of Verve Associates and Dan Bausch from Apprise. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is one of several planned webinars that will be conducted to review the reporting requirements for the fiscal year 2021 Performance Data Form. Today's webinar will be a repeat of the content presented yesterday and will focus exclusively on Module 2 and the Performance Measures Reporting Requirements. This webinar has four purposes. First, this webinar will furnish an update on the status of the Performance Data Form. Second, the webinar will provide an overview of Module 2 performance measures. Third, this webinar will explain how to report on supplemental funds, including ARPA and CARES Act funds. And finally, this webinar will highlight key reminders and ways to avoid common reporting issues in the performance measures module. The audience for today's webinar includes LIHEAP state coordinators and staff who work on the performance measures module. A second 90-minute webinar for newer staff or staff that want additional guidance will be scheduled soon. We greatly appreciate your time to join us today, and we hope that this is helpful as you prepare to complete your performance data form for fiscal year 2021. Melissa, please take it away.
Thank you, Sharnice, and welcome everyone. Today's webinar will be 60 minutes, and we'll be reviewing key information on Module 2 of the Performance Data Form. There are slides from today's webinar already available for download under the handout section in your GoToWebinar sidebar. And this webinar is being recorded and will be published on the ACF YouTube channel. Next slide, please. We encourage you as you're listening to the webinar today to go ahead and ask questions as we go along. And to do this, you'll just want to type your questions into the question box, and you can see a little diagram here on how to find that. Your submitted questions will be reviewed, and they'll be responded to at the end of the webinar. And if we don't have time to respond to them on the webinar, we'll call you afterwards and respond one-on-one. We include this slide in all of our webinars. It's helpful because a lot of the content we have in these reporting webinars is dense, and so we know you'll want to go back and look at these slides again and study different parts of them. And so this is kind of your table of contents. And so I'm not going to review this today, but it's a good slide to come back to so that you can find exactly what you need in the future. Now, today's webinar is going over Module 2 of the Performance Data Form. This is the mandatory section of the form that relates to performance measures. There are two other sections of the form. Module 1 is the grantee survey. This is also mandatory, and it looks at sources and uses of funds. And Module 3 is optional, and it looks at some performance measures that are not required to report by states. But as I mentioned, and Sharnice mentioned, today's focus is on Module 2, the updates to that form, and all of the details you need to get it filled out and completed. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dan to begin to talk about that.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate taking your time to be here. So we did want to give you an update on the Performance Data Form and its status. So the Performance Data Form, its OMB approval expired back in April. That's OMB needs to approve data collection forms for the federal government on a periodic basis, and the Performance Data Form's approval reached its expiration date. So OCS has gone through the process of submitting requests to OMB to reinstate the form and renew the form, and they are waiting for a decision from OMB about doing so, which could come any day. They've also submitted that form to OMB with proposed changes that we're going to go over today in the webinar. So there has not been an action transmittal issued yet or instructions issued, and OCS is planning to do that once the form is finalized and approved by OMB. There was recently a communication put out by OCS about reports and some other reporting developments, and that communication mentioned March 31st as the due date for the 2021 Performance Data Form. That is the current expected due date. It won't be any sooner. It is possible it may be later depending on OMB approval. OCS realizes that this situation can be a little bit difficult, so we have included here a draft version of what the form looks like that was submitted for reinstatement to OMB. It's in the handout bar, probably on the right side of your screen. It's an Excel spreadsheet, similar to the spreadsheets you worked with last year. Okay, next slide. If you worked on the performance data form last year, because of changes that were made to the grantee survey last year, the form was not available in the OLDC system that you use for some of your other reports. And OCS instead asked you to submit the performance data form using a spreadsheet that they provided and saving that spreadsheet or uploading it to Basecamp, where each state had an individual folder. OCS is planning to follow that same approach for the 2021 performance data form. That would involve each grantee receiving a communication that provides them with their link to that Basecamp folder again and includes their 2021 performance data form spreadsheet. This last bullet at the bottom, we want to just emphasize for you that even though in the handouts there's a copy of what the form looks like, each state receives their own customized spreadsheet for the performance data form because the Module 1 part of the form, the grantee survey, includes your funding amounts that you received for FY 2021 or you carried into FY 2021. So you're going to want to use that specific customized spreadsheet when you're submitting your final performance data form. So now we're going to focus in, like Melissa said, on Module 2, which is the performance measures. Module 2's the data on that module has been submitted since FY 2016, so several years now. The performance measures focuses on three main types of information that need to be reported and that the report helps to calculate. The first is the report provides information on how well LIHEAP assistance is targeted and impacting households' energy burdens across different fuel types and different groups of households. Second, the performance measures also collects data on how LIHEAP assistance helped restore energy service to households that did not have energy service, such as for a disconnection or running out of fuel or equipment that is no longer operational. And then lastly, the performance measures collects data on the number of instances where LIHEAP assistance during a fiscal year helped prevent the imminent loss of energy service. Together, these three types of data help provide measurable information for you as a grantee, for OCS, for the administration, and for the public to understand annual LIHEAP impacts on households and targeting performance over time. So performance measures is important to be getting at impacts beyond number of households served and how funds were obligated and used. Next slide. So as I mentioned, since 2016, Module 2 has been collected, and that information has been looking at the overall impacts of LIHEAP assistance on recipients. So OCS has proposed additions to the performance measures, starting with the FY 2021 performance measures. And the purpose of those additions and the changes that are being proposed is so that there's information available to grantees, HHS, and the public on the impacts specifically of the supplemental funds that were issued in response to the pandemic. So we're going to talk about those changes, but we're first going to talk about what has not changed. So you are still asked as part of Module 2 to complete the report looking at the overall impacts on your household served in FY 2021. So that means those same three different sections of information: energy burden information, where you go out to energy vendors, you collect annual bill data for LIHEAP households from your top vendors. You combine that with your program data and produce different statistics that help look at energy burden for LIHEAP households. And you're still asked to report the total number of instances where LIHEAP restored lost energy service and where LIHEAP prevented loss of service. So this means that the process and the procedures that you use to complete the performance measures, the process of collecting the data, of calculating the statistics, those remain the same. So the new additions ask you to take 2 additional steps beyond what you've done in the past. The first change is that the form is asking you to identify and to be able to filter down to households who received a CARES benefit in 2021 if you provided any CARES benefits during that time, and to produce the same statistics on energy burden, on restorations, and on preventions. The second change is similar, but is focused on your ARPA benefits and ARPA households. It's asking you to take your data set, take your household, identify the ones that received an ARPA benefit and what their ARPA benefit was, and produce the same statistics again. This last bullet on the bottom of this slide, I also want to highlight for you. This doesn't mean you're making any new requests to vendors or you're sending them multiple requests. Instead, this means you go about the same process you've used in the past of making vendor requests or of getting vendor data from your system, producing the report, looking at overall impacts, but then taking these additional steps of producing statistics just for the subset or subgroup of households who got CARES, and then again for the subset that got ARPA benefits during 2021. If you've downloaded the form that's in the handouts, you can see what it looks like in the spreadsheet template. The form looks similar to the past. You'll see there's a tab for Module 1. The main difference is that Module 2 has 3 tabs now instead of 1. The first tab is labeled 2A, and that's where you report information on all the households with data. And this is where you report the same information you would have reported in the past. If you did provide CARES assistance during 2021, or you did provide ARPA assistance, you also want to make sure that that's included. It's not just regular LIHEAP funds only. It's any type of LIHEAP assistance is included in that in the overall performance measures. Then there's a tab that's labeled 2B, and that's where you would put the statistics or the information for the subgroup of households from 2A who received CARES benefits. And then there's tab 2C, which is where you'd report on the subset who received ARPA benefits. So 2A is overall, and then 2B is the subgroup that got CARES, and 2C is for reporting the subgroup that got ARPA. All the tabs look the same and have the same sections and rows and columns. It's just reporting the right information on the right tab. Okay, so it's always helpful to look at examples just to make sure we understand and to make sure it can be clear in a real way. So we're going to look at section 5. That's the energy burden targeting section where you report statistics like average annual income, average annual main heating bill, and the form calculates energy burden. So there's 3 parts to section 5. Part A is where you report the number of households that got bill payment assistance in the fiscal year. Then for part B, you report on households from that group for which you collected their energy bill data. So most states, you serve a certain number of households, but you only get their complete energy bill data from a sample of vendors. So the households that you report in part B are a smaller group out of part A. And then the last part of section 5 is part C, where you report on the top 25% of households that have the highest energy burden and are categorized as high burden. So it goes down from A down to B and then to a smaller group in part C. So to complete section 5, there's 4 steps you need to follow. The first is you identify the total households that got bill payment assistance, and that gets reported in that part A line. You go out to your energy vendors and collect energy expenditure data from a sample of them. When you have that data back, you identify which households have the complete energy data so that you can include them in part B. And then you use that collected energy data and your program data to calculate the statistics for part B and part C. So these are the 4 steps you work on to complete section 5. So we're going to look at this in a visual way and talk about how the additions to the form, how you would go about completing those. So here, this circle on the left side of this slide that's blue, this is your population, all the households that received a bill payment assistance benefit. Let's say there were 25,000 households you served in fiscal year 2021. Of those 25,000, you'll have complete annual energy bill data from your vendors for some portion of those 25,000, and that here is represented by the green circle. So it'll be a smaller number. Let's say it's 15,000. For those 15,000, you compute different statistics for section 5: annual income, main heating bill, LIHEAP benefit amount, etc. And that's what gets reported in section 5, part B. So the new requirements ask you to produce those same statistics, but then to take the additional step of filtering to households who received CARES assistance and filtering to households who received ARPA assistance. So in this case, in this example, this grantee collected data for 15,000 households. They use those to produce the main performance measures results. Then they'll need to identify which of those 15,000 received CARES and which of those 15,000 received ARPA, and reproduce the statistics for each of those subsets. So using this visual again, we have the 25,000 households served here in blue. We go down to the 15,000 that have energy bill data collected, produce the statistics that go on the 2A tab. Then we identify which households received CARES out of those 15,000 that have energy data. And in this case, 5,000 had received CARES assistance out of those 15,000. And you'd produce the same statistics for just those 5,000 households. Similarly for ARPA, you would identify households that received ARPA. In this example, it's 3,000 out of the 15,000, and reproduce the statistics. So same information and statistics, just for different groupings. And grantees are using your supplemental funds in different ways and at different times. So some of you during 2021 may not have served any households with CARES benefits. So you may have nothing for Module 2B in the middle. Others of you may have given benefits to households so that they received both CARES and ARPA, and there would be overlap of the two circles you see here in orange and in pink. It just depends on how you've used those funds and when you've used them. But this is just one example to help illustrate how you'd report for these new sections. And we're going to show you some more examples later in the webinar. Okay, so what do you need to be able to do this? You need two additional pieces of information for your households. You need to know the CARES benefit amount a household received, if anything, and the ARPA benefit amount a household received, if anything. This is similar to the household report and the grantee survey changes that were made in response to the supplemental funds being issued. So remember that for the household report, you needed to be able to identify and report on the number of households that received CARES or ARPA for each assistance type in that report. And also for the grantee survey, you report on how you obligated the CARES and ARPA funds, but you also report on the average benefit amount that was provided with those funds. So these requirements for those reports, there's similar data is used to be able to identify the households that received CARES and ARPA benefits to report on these new changes for the performance measures. So this is a slide showing what your data may look like each year when you've completed the performance measures. So this is a table and the rows are households. So household 1 through 5 going down the rows. And the columns are the different data fields you would have in your data set to be able to complete the performance measures report. These could be in a query or inside of a database or inside of a spreadsheet you may have. So for example, household 1, you have their main heating fuel as propane, their main heating bill as $2,800, their electric bill is $1,200, and their LIHEAP benefit is $525. With this information for these households, you compute different averages and means going down each column. So you can see that at the bottom. And this is what you would report for your overall performance measures on Module 2A. So the new elements you need if we go forward is the CARES benefit amount and the ARPA benefit amount. So you can see that out of these 5 households, just 2 of them received a CARES benefit amount. Household 2 and household 4, if we click one more time. So just those 2 households in the red boxes received CARES benefit. And so when you're looking at the Module 2B to report the performance measures for CARES, you would filter down to those 2 households and recalculate the same statistics. The only difference being that for the average benefit amount, the interest is in what the CARES average benefit amount was. So for example, household 2, their total benefits they received from any funding source in 2021 was $750. $200 out of that $750 were from a CARES benefit, maybe a supplemental benefit, maybe a special type of assistance. And so you would want to use the CARES benefit amount when you're calculating the average benefit and reporting that. Similar thing for ARPA, filtering down to the household number 1 and recomputing the statistics. Okay, I'll turn it to Melissa and take a breather.
All right, so Dan just laid out what the new changes are for the form for FY 2021. And so you'll be doing the same report you always do, including CARES and ARPA funds, but you may also be asked to drill down to subsets of CARES and ARPA to fill out 2 additional tabs. And so given this, how hard will it be for your state to identify and report on CARES and ARPA data for the performance measures? Will it be very difficult, somewhat easy, or very easy? And I'll let Connor track and give us the results.
I'll give folks another handful of seconds here to submit their responses. All right, it looks like everyone who's going to has responded, so I'll go ahead and close and share those results.
Great. So we have, this requires me to do math, it looks like about half and half. So very difficult and somewhat difficult. We have a little less than half of the respondents, and a little over half think it's going to be somewhat easy or very easy. So that's good to hear. For those of you who are thinking it might be difficult, we're going to talk a little bit more today. We're going to offer additional training, and we'll also offer at the end of this webinar a number of resources for you all that should be able to help you put together this report. So Dan mentioned early on that there's some key steps when putting together this report, regardless of whether you know, it's 1 module or 3 modules. And we're going to go over those briefly to talk about what you should be thinking about and kind of the way you should be looking at how this is chunked out in terms of workload. So let's look at key step 1. This doesn't change at all given the new requirements. For Section 5, grantees need to have the annual energy bill data for bill payment households. And so to do this, many of you have arrangements with utilities where you go out each year and request the data. Some of you have real-time exchanges. But for most of you, you're identifying the top energy vendors for each fuel. A reminder, this is the top 5 electric, top 5 natural gas, and then top 10 propane, fuel oil, or other types of fuel. And so you can limit it to that, and you'll want to go out to those vendors and get whatever data you can for the households who are receiving services from those vendors, whether it's their main heat or their electric. When you get that data back, you'll want to review it and make sure it looks right and that you have everything you need. You'll want to do this for whoever's in your system who received any kind of bill payment assistance in FY 2021, whether it was CARES, ARPA, or regular LIHEAP. This is not something that's impacted, which means you should already be doing this or thinking about getting this done. So this is the first key piece of work that you need to do, is get those annual main heating and electric expenditures in hand for those households that receive bill payment assistance from you in FY 2021. The next step is, once you get all that data back, right, you get to mush it together with the data that's in your database, things like income and things like their benefit amount. And Dan showed you earlier that, you know, he had an Excel spreadsheet with each household on the line. And this is really kind of what this key step 2 is that you're basically getting every household in a line, and you are putting down what are their annual main heating expenditures, electric expenditures, and the total benefits they got for the year, and their annual income, because then this is going to be used to calculate the averages you need for your report. This is also the step where, as Dan said, you're going to see some households drop off, because remember that to include them in parts 5B and 5C of the report, they have to have both main heating fuel and electric data. And so if you have households that have one or the other or none, those households are going to get dropped out of the data set. And we get a lot of calls from people each year that say, wait, I think I did something wrong because we served 30,000 households and I only have 10,000 now with enough data to include. I must have done something wrong. Well, no, you didn't do anything wrong. It's normal to have a significant number of households drop off. And we have tools in place to help you build that number up over time so it gets closer to the number you actually served. But this is where you would drop those households out that don't have main heating and electric data both. Key step 3 is calculating those statistics. So you have a row for each household. You know what their total benefits were, you know what their income was, you know what their total residential energy costs were because you've got both their main heating and their electric, and now you're going to start averaging all those households together, including their average annual income, average annual main heating bill, average annual electric bill, and their average total benefit received. Now, there are potentially 3 tabs on this year's form, so tab 2A is going to include their ARPA benefit, their CARES benefit, and their regular LIHEAP. And of course, you all know that there could be multiple benefits in each of those categories. So you're going to sum all their benefits together that they got, and then take the average among all the households. Key step 4 is this high burden part. So you calculated, averages for all the households who have both main heating fuel and electric data in part B. And now part C is asking you to, of those households, take the highest burden ones and calculate the same statistics. So if you can go to the next slide, I like the picture better than the words. You can see once again, we have this Excel spreadsheet where you have a list of households that we talked about in step 2. And it's got their main heating fuel and their annual income, their total bill, which is their main heating and their electric. And the first step is, after you've calculated their annual energy bill, is to calculate their energy burden. And remember that energy burden is the portion of income that is the energy bill. So you're dividing their residential energy bill by their annual income to calculate that. Now, in the purple box here, we have a key step for your developers. And so if there are any IT staff online, or even just people who love Excel, you know that anytime you have a 0, you're going to get an error. And so it's really important to go back in and hard code anyone with 0 income as 100% energy burden. And so that's what you're going to do to get around that 0 error. Once you have everybody's energy burden in that separate column, you're going to sort it and you're going to take the top 25%. And those are the households that you're going to include in section C of the report. So once you have sections B and C done, then you're going to move on to prevention and restoration. If you could go to the next slide. For restoration, this is about households where LIHEAP restored energy service that's already been lost. So these are people that come in who already are disconnected, people who come in who are already out of fuel, or their equipment is inoperable or not working. And so you're counting anyone where LIHEAP changed that situation. And this is a case where you're not counting unduplicated counts. We know that there are households that come in for a regular benefit and then a crisis benefit, maybe in the winter, and then they come back in the summer for another regular crisis benefit. And each time they come in, they're already disconnected or have a disconnect notice or whatever it might be. And so we're not asking you to unduplicate those households. If the same household came in 3 times already disconnected, then you would count 3 times in this report. So this is an easier number to calculate than some of the others. And it's the same situation for prevention on the next step. In this case, we're looking at times when LIHEAP prevented imminent, can you move the slide forward, please? Prevented imminent loss of home energy. And so anyone that comes in with a disconnect notice or past due notice, anyone who comes in who's low on fuel, some states define this as, say, 25% of the tank, or someone who comes in with a equipment that is on its way out, it's ready to kick the bucket. And you know that if you don't get it replaced this season, they're going to be out of heat. And so these are situations when LIHEAP once again reversed and made it possible for them to keep their energy on or maintain equipment that actually provides heat for their home. And so once again, it's actually very frequent that people will wait until they get a disconnect notice or a shut off notice or past due to come in and get assistance. And so you'll want to count each time that they come in versus just counting the household ones. So when you look at the new changes and how that'll affect these steps, your step one is not going to change. You're going to go out to the vendors and you're going to grab data for as many people as you can that use that vendor, whether they got ARPA, whether they got CARES, or whether they got regular funds. But steps 2 through 6 kind of then need to be adjusted for CARES or ARPA only to fill out those other 2 tabs. Because as Dan mentioned, you're not just pulling out the households that got those benefits, you're also isolating those benefits alone. So when I pull out the CARES households, I'm also only going to report their total benefit as the total amount of CARES they got. I'm not going to include any ARPA or regular funds they received. So you really will need to have, although it's a subset, it really is 3 different data sets at the end of the day in order to pull the statistics for this report. There are many of you who use past year reports as kind of a check to make sure that your numbers aren't wackadoo, or that you didn't calculate something wrong, you're not way off. But it's important to realize, and you all know very, very well, that there were a lot of impacts of the pandemic and of supplemental funds on the types of services you offered and the people that you served. And so just to kind of review those, it says may see, but most of you will see changes in your performance measures results because of the pandemic. So some states had COVID-related shut-off moratoria during FY 2020, but these ceased during FY 2021. And so some of you may see a really large increase in restorations and preventions compared to FY 2020. Many grantees weren't comfortable going into others' homes, and so you had limited weatherization or equipment services in FY 2020, but you may have resumed those activities in 2021. And so when you begin to look at equipment restoration and prevention measures, those numbers may be significantly different between 2020 and 2021. If you expanded or changed your eligibility requirements, you're going to see changes in the characteristics of your LIHEAP population. And you're also going to see differences in the average annual income or the average annual energy bill due to the economic and social impacts of the pandemic. People were home more, for example, and using their energy more, so you may see higher bills. And people may have lost their jobs, so you're going to see differences in their income. So the pandemic alone is going to impact the data and the changes in the data between 2020 and 2021. Next slide, please. So we mentioned this already, but households provided with CARES or ARPA benefits in FY 2021 should be included when preparing information for the performance measures report. We may not have approval yet for the form, but what we do know is that we're pretty certain that in Section 2A, you're going to be asked to report on any funds that you used, regardless of whether it was CARES, ARPA, or regular, which means that for vendor data requests, you should include any household that received bill payment assistance and use that vendor for service. Households should not be excluded because of the funding source used from your vendor data requests. And similar to the sections 6 and 7 that look at restoration and prevention, you should be counting any households based on the criteria for restoration and prevention, whether they got CARES, ARPA, or regular LIHEAP funding. Next slide. Now, I mentioned some of the changes you're going to see in your report because of the pandemic itself, but in addition to the pandemic, you also got a whole bunch of extra money. And so you're also going to see changes related to this. For example, if you provided extra benefits to a larger portion of your clients, the average benefit amounts in your report will be higher. If you targeted additional or new benefits for crisis situations, you might see a larger number of prevention or restoration occurrences. And if you serve more households than normal, just overall, you might just see other differences in the characteristics of households served. So once again, if you're using your last year's data kind of as a baseline, or even previous year's data as a baseline to say whether you're in the zone or not, you may want to take these potential changes into consideration. And now Dan's going to go over some more examples for all of you.
Yeah, so we've described a lot of information to you, and now we're going to step back a little bit and kind of look at the big picture of what the performance measures can tell you and what your report might look like based on how you used your supplemental funds. Okay, so the first example we're going to look at is State X, and State X served about 50,000 households in 2021. They didn't provide any CARES benefits during 2021. They used them all the prior year, for example. But they did use ARPA funds. They provided a $200 supplemental benefit to most of the households that they served during 2021. So if your state's like this, you issued a supplemental benefit to most households, this is an example of what your report could look like. This is a simplified version of what's in the performance data form so that we could fit key information on a slide. The first line, part A, you can see that 50,000 households is listed in the column on the left. That's your overall performance measures, the same as you've done in the past. So 50,000 households were served. Going down a little, of those 50,000, about half, 25,000, had data collected from energy vendors and could be used in Section 5, Part B. So for those 25,000, the state computed the average income, average benefit amount, these different statistics, and the performance measures shows them that the average energy burden of their households was 10% before they received LIHEAP assistance based on their energy expenses and their income. And after LIHEAP assistance, the energy burden was reduced to 6%. So there was a 4% reduction. In the middle, Module 2B for CARES, this State X didn't use CARES during 2021. So they have 0 households and nothing to report on. They did use CARES. They served most households with CARES. You can see it's 48,000 in the right-hand column. So 48,000 out of 50,000. Out of the 25,000 that they had collected data for, almost all, 24,800, received that CARES supplemental benefit. And then they produced all the statistics again for just those 24,800. And the interesting thing here is that you can see that overall households got their burden reduced from 10% to 6%. And the ARPA information in Module 2C tells you that about 2% of that energy burden reduction was because of that supplemental ARPA benefit. So it helps give you and OCS and others information about the significance and the impact of the ARPA funds. Okay, we're going to look at a second example. This is State Y. We're going to say that State Y used their CARES funds not to issue a supplemental benefit, but to instead provide targeted assistance. In this case, they used CARES to provide 5,000 households that had the highest arrearages with arrearage assistance up to $3,000. They didn't use their ARPA funds during FY 2021, they saved them for 2022. So when we look down at the table, you can see they have their overall data for their full population. They have data for the CARES subset for those five, for that subgroup, that's starts at 5,000 in the top row. And then module 2C for ARPA is 0 because they didn't use ARPA. Here, the results are a little different than the last example. If you stay in the module 2A column and go down, they got data for 20,000 of their households. They produced the statistics, and you can see that the pre-LIHEAP energy burden was 13%, and the post-LIHEAP energy burden was 9%. If we focus in on the CARES households, they have data for 3,000 of the CARES households, and they produced the same statistics again, average income, average benefit amount. Here, the average benefit amount is a lot higher for the CARES subset because they received this special benefit targeting arrearage forgiveness up to $3,000, which is higher than benefits other households receive for regular LIHEAP assistance. So their pre-burden starts off higher at 18%, and it actually ends lower at 3% because of the way that their CARES funds were targeted and the benefit levels they provided. Okay, we're going to look at one more example, and this is State Z, and now we're going to focus in on the restoration and prevention data. State Z, if a household applies in that state, and when they apply, they are disconnected from electric service, they receive a crisis benefit to have their electric turned on. And if they received a disconnection notice and they apply for LIHEAP, they get a crisis benefit as well to help pay the balance owed. They provided a total of 500 households with crisis assistance because they were disconnected, and 800 households with assistance for having a past due notice. So you can see in the table at the bottom on module 2A, they report 500 on the line for occurrences where energy service was restored after a disconnection, because 500 got crisis assistance due to being disconnected. And they'd report 800 on the past due notice or disconnect notice line because there were 800 times that a benefit was provided, a crisis benefit was provided due to receiving a past due notice. This state used CARES in 2021, but they know that they only use them for regular assistance and not for crisis assistance. So none of their CARES funds were used to help people that were disconnected or in imminent risk of disconnection. So module 2B, you'll have 0 for these fields. But the last bullet mentions that they did use ARPA funds to help 100 households that got shut off when the COVID moratoria were lifted in that state. So those households were shut off. ARPA funds were used to restore their service. So that means 100 out of the 500 received ARPA funds, and they're reported on the energy service was restored after disconnection line in that third module 2C tab. So these are just a few examples to help. It's a lot to see at once, so we recommend you download the slides and look at them more when you have time. Okay, we're going to move forward and I'll talk a little bit about data validations and checks.
Thanks, Dan. So I want to underscore what Dan said. This is a lot to take in during a webinar, and so really encourage you all to download this, to call us and ask questions. We'll give you a lot of resources towards the very end of this, but it's normal to feel a little overwhelmed when you're looking at all of this at once. Just so that you know, OCS has implemented steps to help you with completing the report accurately. So within the spreadsheet that you're all going to receive, there are calculated fields. So whenever possible, OCS has included formulas that calculate the fields to reduce your burden and to reduce potential reporting issues. And then there are some that are locked. So if it doesn't require a value, it'll be locked, and you'll know that you don't need to fill it out. When you submit your report, just so that you have some understanding of the process, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. Apprise checks the data and will email grantees to alert you to any issues or questions based on their review. Many of you are familiar with this process. You've been in touch with Apprise in the past. The checks are intended to help ensure your report is accurate and that we're reporting on any context or nuances that is needed to understand the data. So this includes making sure that there's internal consistency in the report. In other words, they're checking to make sure that if you have data in one field, it doesn't contradict data in another field. They're going to be looking at your notes to make sure everything's clear and explains any kind of, weird anomalies that they might see in the data. And they're also going to make sure that the data you're reporting in this report jives with the data that you've put into other reports like the household report or the grantee survey. When your report is confirmed as complete, you will be notified. So if you turn in something and you are an overachiever and it's perfect to begin with, you will get a note that says it's all good to go. I'm going to turn it back over to Dan, who's going to give us some final reminders.
Okay. So to summarize, the performance data form is currently in the process of being renewed and reinstated by OMB. OCS is waiting for the final decision. OCS has not yet issued an action transmittal and the instructions, but will be doing so once the form is finalized. The new due date will be no sooner than March 31st. We do encourage you to prepare and to plan. We have the proposed version of the form under the handouts. And as we discussed during the webinar, there are no changes to the approach of reaching out to your vendors and collecting that data. There are proposed additions to Module 2. Those are focused on identifying and filtering down to CARES and ARPA assistance and producing the statistics for those groups, those subgroups. You still need to produce the main report on overall impacts, but you're asked to take these additional steps. We do have resources available related to the performance measures, especially if you're newer. There's resources about how to identify your top vendors, what kind of information to send to vendors, calculation procedures, things to check before you submit. So we encourage you to look at these.
Okay, so we have some poll questions. I know that these are kind of a pain, but they really help us. So I appreciate your time in filling them out. How confident are you that you understand how to correctly complete FY 2021 performance measures? Are you not at all confident, not too confident, somewhat confident, or very confident?
And I'll give folks just a few more seconds here to submit their responses. All right, I'll go ahead and close that out and share the results.
Well, great. We don't have anyone in the top line. That makes me happy. Not too confident. We have about 12%, but the rest of you feel like you're either somewhat confident or very confident. For those of you who are not too confident, we're going to share some additional training resources as well as some support resources right now.
Yes, we will be having more webinars. We're planning. This is an hour-long review highlighting the changes, but we're planning a longer webinar to go line by line for both the performance measures and Module 1, the grantee survey. And we really encourage you, if you have questions, especially as you're starting to work on the report, to reach out, or if you need assistance. Next slide. Here's our information. You can reach out to contact us, or of course your liaison about needs you may have or concerns. We're going to do one more poll question. So Connor will open this poll. How likely is it that you may need to reach out to Apprise for assistance while completing your 2021 performance measures form? After this poll, we'll open it up for questions. But if you could please respond to this would also be helpful.
And I'll give folks a few more seconds here. All right, I'll go ahead and close and share.
Okay, well, this is really helpful to see a pretty even mix across them, but we see some of you are saying likely, somewhat likely, or very likely. So again, if you need to reach out, please don't hesitate to do so. Okay, I think it's time for questions, Connor.
Yep. So this one actually was submitted during the session group yesterday, but I think it's an important one and a good one, so I'm going to do it here as well. So the question was, to confirm, tab A should be the overall performance measures and should include households that got regular funds, ARPA, or CARES, and should include the total benefit they got from LIHEAP funding sources. Tab 2B should include households that got CARES and should account for the benefit that they received from CARES funds. And tab 2C should include households who got benefits from ARPA and should include the benefit amount that they got from ARPA, correct?
Yes, yeah, as I heard it, that's correct. You know, one important thing is if this was your first year for the household report, for the 2021 household report, the first time you had to fill out the CARES lines, for example, that means your performance measures report as well would be the first time you're using and having to report on CARES information. So that first tab where you're reporting the overall impacts should include households that got any kind of bill payment assistance from any funding source. Then when you move to the two new tabs, you're filtering down to if the household received bill payment assistance with CARES and to the amount that they received from CARES, for example, for the 2B module. I saw a question in the question bar about the spreadsheets for states and when those would be coming. So I know the spreadsheets are being worked on, and I think they should be coming pretty soon. They're expecting to hear back from OMB very soon as well. So I think they should hopefully be coming very soon, but I don't have an exact date or time. In terms of Module 2, though, there'll be nothing in Module 2 that's pre-populated. Module 2 will be exactly like the template that you see.
Okay, and one other question here, Dan, was what kind of assistance can Apprise provide for the performance measures?
That's a good one. I'll let Melissa jump in too, but I think the first thing is sometimes just talking through what the issues you may be facing are and what kind of concerns there are can help identify maybe there's a simple approach or a simple solution that may be known from having worked with another state or from Melissa's experience that would help. So sometimes just a conversation helps to figure out a good approach to solve a problem. We also can help with working and communicating the information to different people that might be working on the report, and then sometimes as well with data, the actual data processing work. Is there anything you want to add, Melissa?
I would just say that I think some of the most valuable help we've given or heard about is being able to talk directly to your IT, either your vendor or your developer or your internal staff, so that you're not having to, hear what we say and then translate it back and, act as a go-between. And we can also talk with your utilities. So if you're having, or your vendor, so if they're having trouble understanding what they need to get to you, or you're having issues communicating with them, we're happy to talk with them as well.
All right, well, we've come to the end of our hour here. I don't see any other questions in the queue right now, but of course, if any of you have any additional questions, our contact information is on that slide a few slides ago in the deck, so please do feel free to shoot us an email or give us a call.
Thank you for your time today, and
Thank you.
look forward to hearing from you.